Hi everybody and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about false guilty pleas and plea bargaining, which is actually a really big issue in our criminal justice system and something that happens actually quite a bit. So what is plea bargaining? Plea bargaining is simply just an arrangement between the state and the defendant in which the defendant pleads guilty to a crime, typically in exchange for some type of leniency in sentencing, right? And so typically it's you plead guilty to a lesser charge or a lighter sentence and don't waste our time for a trial, and we'll call it even. Over 14,000 defendants per day choose whether to accept a plea or take their case to trial, and 90 to 95% of those defendants will take the plea, right? And so if you think about it, that is up to 13,300 defendants that are taking a guilty plea every day in America. This is kind of a gray area in a black and white system, right? Because there is implicit as well as explicit promises of leniency. And do those promises actually cause people who might be innocent to accept a plea because it might actually be better for them? We'll talk about that here in a minute. If we look at the history of plea bargaining, it's beliefs that the plea bargaining is at least as old as the 19th century, right? There's no direct evidence of plea bargaining. There's just all of a sudden a super high rate of guilty pleas. There's this spike in guilty pleas. It's unsure if history is merely isolated incidents or actually common practices also. However, illusions of plea bargaining do begin in the 1860s, and these are considered kind of under-the-table deals that are happening. In the 20th century, it's much more commonly discussed, and in fact is not in any way considered controversial today because of the congestions in courts. We agree that pretty much pleas happen, right? And there's no real question about whether or not pleas happen. Why do people offer a plea, though, and why do defendants accept a plea? Well, a prosecutor will offer a plea because they've got limited resources and they want a high success rate. Prosecutors' job is to get convictions, right? A prosecutor who has a low conviction rate is not considered a very good prosecutor, right? Plea bargaining ensures that they get a guilty verdict, right? And so they can count that as a win for them. Same thing for defense attorneys. Defense attorneys also have limited resources, and so they can't spend a lot of time on each case. And also public versus private counsel. Public defenders especially are so tapped for time and money that if they can clear as many cases as possible with pleas and not drag everything out into long trials, they're going to like that a lot better. Private counsel typically is willing to fight a little more aggressively and willing to risk actually taking the case to trial over public defenders. But still, private counsel still do accept pleas quite a bit. The defendant has a lot of motivations to accept pleas also. Number one, it's a speedy resolution. We just want it over and done with, right? Let's just get this case behind us and we can move on. There's a potential for trial penalties, right? What if instead of accepting a 5-year plea, I get 15 years in prison? That's also a plea discount, right? It's also risk management. What's my probability of conviction? Okay, it's pretty high, weighed against the plea offer. There's also a prior record and publicity, right? You can make terms of the plea that there's a gag order, so no one knows how long you're going to be incarcerated or anything else, right? And so you can actually, work the system a little bit. There are, of course, some criticisms of plea bargaining. It's been shown that there are pretty severe racial disparities in the system, such that white people typically get offered better pleas than any other group. It also, some argue, infringes on the defendant's constitutional right to receive justice, right? There is no longer, if you accept a plea, Sixth Amendment protections. You don't get a speedy trial. You don't get a jury trial. You don't get to confront witnesses against you, right? In an adversarial system, right, where two sides are allegedly duking it out and fighting each other for the best possible outcome to see who's winning, you lose all of that, right? You lose the adversarial nature of this because what is a plea bargain? It's a big negotiation. It's both sides working together for a common goal instead of against each other, right? So there's lack of trial procedures and protections, like evidence, cross-examination, expert testimony. The Supreme Court has even weighed in on this as to who is provided an attorney and at what stage of the process. There's a bunch of different cases that suggest when an attorney is legally allowed or legally required, or at least your right should be informed. With recent focus, because of there's Supreme Court has become cognizant of high percentage of guilty pleas, they've started to acknowledge that there is a possibility of false guilty pleas. So, the theoretical background for even studying false guilty pleas is this kind of shadow of trial theory, right? It looks at the trial penalty potential and the plea discount, and it's almost an equation, right? So the sentence at the plea X will be equal to the sentence at trial Y discounted by the probability of conviction at trial, right? And so as long as the plea sentence is less than the probability of conviction at trial plus or multiplied by the sentence at trial, people are going to accept a plea, right? And so for sake of argument, let's say you're looking at 15 years in prison if you go to trial, and your probability of conviction is 100%. P times Y is going to equal 15, right? If they're offering you a plea of 3 years, well, that's significant difference. You're going to accept the plea. So I've got some hypotheticals here. What would you do? Charges are murder and sexual assault with the possible death penalty at trial. The evidence is DNA against you, and you confessed to the crime. The plea is life without the possibility of the death penalty. What would you do? In a slightly less serious situation, the charge is just rape. The punishment is a life sentence. The evidence against you, the victim identifies you, your alibi is uncorroborated, and you've confessed to the crime. The plea is 10 to 15 years. What would you do? Well, Chris here was in that first situation. He literally was convicted of a crime. Accused of murder and sexual assault. There was DNA evidence against him, and he confessed. So he accepted a plea of life in prison. DNA eventually exonerated him from that crime. John Watkins was accused of rape. The victim identified him, and there was an uncorroborated alibi. Again, he entered a plea for 14 years instead of getting life in prison. So false guilty pleas, do they occur? Of course they do, every single day. Roughly 30 individuals exonerated with the help of the Innocence Project actually pled guilty at trial, right? They've served a combined 150 years in prison. Of course, true guilty pleas also occur every day. And so this is where it becomes very, very difficult. Much like confessions, right? There are false confessions and true confessions every day. There are false guilty pleas and true guilty pleas every single day. Estimates of the prevalence of false guilty pleas range anywhere from 5 to 11% of total guilty pleas. So the conservative estimate is somewhere around 630 false guilty pleas every single day in America, which is kind of a big problem, right? In experimental research on false guilty pleas, we see that over the course of several studies, innocent participants plead guilty somewhere between 20 to 60% of the time they are confronted with a crime that they did not commit, right? Of course, there are susceptible populations to false guilty pleas, such as mentally ill, right? 17 to 41% of roughly 1,300 people surveyed would accept a guilty plea even if they were innocent. Juveniles are also another susceptible population, much like in anything else. Innocent juveniles are twice as likely than adults to say they would falsely plead guilty if it meant they were getting some sort of leniency. Also, individuals represented by public defenders are significantly more likely to accept a guilty plea. Now, I know what a lot of you are probably thinking. Why in the world would anyone accept a false guilty plea if they were actually innocent? Well, there's a lot of actual reasons for it. The motivations are sometimes to protect someone else. Sometimes they feel heavily pressured by the system. They view the situation as futile, right? I'm a young black male. Everyone's decided I'm guilty. If I go to trial, they're going to convict me. So I might as well just accept a guilty plea and just start serving my time instead of dragging this out. The over 60% of people interviewed or surveyed said it because of a reduced sentence or the ability to leave jail. And this is a hugely important section, not only because it's the highest percentage, but I'm going to give you guys a hypothetical situation to think about here, okay? You can't afford bail because you're poor, right? You get arrested for a crime and your trial date isn't for a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years away, right? They say you could plead guilty and you could be out in 3 months. Would you rather wait for your day in court a year and a half or be out in 3 months? What would you do? To a lot of people, especially if they're poor and they're worried about their families and they need to get back out there to start making money to help support their families, they're going to say, well, I'm just going to take 3 months then because I'll get out so much sooner. Of course, the issue with that, again, is that you don't think about the long-term consequences of this, right? You come out with a criminal record. What is on every single job application you fill out? Have you ever been accused or convicted of a crime? If so, what? And now you have to try and explain to someone, well, yeah, technically I pled guilty to this crime, but I was really innocent. Trust me. Do you think the employers are going to trust you? Probably not, right? And so this leaving jail or reduced sentence category is actually the largest percentage of false guilty pleas because genuinely they don't have any other choice if they need to get back out there and start working. And then, of course, some people accept guilty pleas. Their motivation is because they're legally innocent but may factually be guilty. And then potential substance abuse is the last one. There is one other noted motivation, and this is the perceived higher probability of conviction, right? If the perceived chance of conviction is about 10% of people will accept a guilty plea even if they're innocent. You jump that up to 90%. If they think, even though I am super guilty, I confessed to this crime, even though it was a false confession, I'm going to get convicted at trial, that number jumps up to a third of the people that are presented with a guilty plea will accept it. And it's a big problem, right? And so again, this is very new cutting edge research here. If you look at the dates for this, the furthest back dates I think were maybe the 70s or 80s, right? And so this is very new research that we haven't really talked about a lot. And a lot of people say, oh, well, you're contributing to your own punishment here, right? You are contributing to your own prison sentence, so you can't get mad at us, right? You can't hold that against us. But the reality is it is a huge problem and something, again, that future researchers need to continue to look at. That's all I've got time for today, and I'll see y'all next time.